A Soviet aircraft carrier, the pride of an empire. A ship that made the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization tremble. Do you know where it is right now? In China. Room number, Moscow. Breakfast included. This is not a joke. This is not a metaphor. This is what really happened to the first Soviet aircraft carrier, and the story that no one has ever told you in full. Our hero today is the heavy aircraft carrying cruiser Kiev. How did a secret ship turn into a hotel? Who made millions from its sale? And why do those names never surface anywhere? And what was left inside when the last sailor latched the hatch behind him? Today, I will reveal everything to you. All the details, all the figures, the whole story. Watch until the end. What you are about to learn will change your understanding of shipbuilding forever. I promise. Somewhere in China, right now, a man is ordering room service. The room is called Moscow. It is located 4 decks below the waterline. The walls around it are not concrete or brick. They are steel. Armor-plated steel several centimeters thick. Outside the porthole, there is no city landscape. Outside the porthole is Bohai Bay, and the dark gray hull of the ship descends into the water. This man is spending the night aboard an active military warship, not in a museum, not in a theme park, on a real combat ship that was once the most classified vessel in the Soviet Union. Its name is Kiev. Let me show you exactly what you see if you look at this ship from the outside. Length, 273 meters. That's about 3 football fields placed end to end. Displacement, 30,530 tons. Imagine taking 25,000 ordinary passenger cars and packing them into one steel box. That is what the Kiev weighs. On board, it carried weapons capable of hitting a target at a distance of 500 kilometers. On its deck, combat aircraft took off. The first Soviet carrier-based attack planes to ever take to the sky outside the Soviet Union. In the 70s and 80s, every time the Kiev sailed into the open ocean, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization immediately sent ships to track it. Frigates, submarines, reconnaissance planes. The entire Western world wanted to know, what is this ship doing? Where is it going? What is it carrying? Today, the only thing tracking it is a tour guide with a microphone. That is what this whole film is about. Not just the story of one ship. It is a story about how empires are born and how they die. About what remains of them. And about how the world treats things that once inspired fear. Metal doesn't forget. Only people forget. But to understand how the Kiev ended up in the Chinese port city of Tianjin with Yalta and Moscow room numbers inside, we need to go back to the beginning of the 60s, to the height of a standoff that once nearly destroyed half the world. October 1962, the Atlantic Ocean, 200 meters deep. Inside the Soviet submarine B-59, the heat is nearing 50 degrees Celsius. The air conditioning is broken. Men are losing consciousness at their battle stations. The crew hasn't surfaced in weeks. There is no contact with Moscow. No one on board knows if the war has begun or not. And suddenly, thuds against the hull, from the outside. These are American ships dropping signaling depth charges. The demand is simple: surface immediately. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, decided that the war had already started. He gave the order to prepare a nuclear torpedo for launch. On board the B-59 at that moment was an officer named Vasily Arkhipov. According to protocol, only his signature could authorize the launch. He refused. He insisted on surfacing. One man, one word. Perhaps the salvation of half the world. The Soviet submarine surfaced, surrounded by American warships. Searchlights hit the conning tower. Cameras clicked. This entire humiliating moment was recorded. That is exactly what they saw in Moscow. That is exactly what they remembered. Now, let's take a step back and understand why this was even possible. Why the naval fleet of the second most powerful nation in the world ended up in such a situation. The answer is simple. The Soviet Union didn't have aircraft carriers. Let me explain what that meant in practice. An aircraft carrier is not just a big ship. It is a floating airfield. It carries dozens of combat aircraft and can deploy them anywhere in the ocean. A whole group of escort ships is built around it. It is a separate little fleet that moves where it needs to go and does what it needs to do. By the early 60s, the United States had over 20 of these carriers. The Soviet Union had none. The Soviet Navy was built on a different logic. Coastal defense, submarines, minefields. It was a fleet that protects its own shores but does not dominate the open ocean. Thousands of miles from home, Soviet ships were vulnerable, which is what October 1962 proved. There was one man who understood this better than anyone, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov. From 1956 and for nearly 30 years, he headed the Soviet Navy. He was a man with a very specific vision. The Soviet fleet should operate in any part of the world's oceans, not hide near the shores. Go out into the open sea and dictate terms there. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a personal insult to him. After October 1962, Gorshkov secured funding for a fundamentally new class of ships, not just cruisers, not just helicopter carriers, which the Soviet Union already had. Something new. A ship that would carry combat jet aircraft. The project received number 1143 and the codename Krechet. The construction site, the Black Sea shipyard in the Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv. But here, a problem arose. A huge, legal, practically unsolvable problem. You can build a ship, but how do you get it out of the Black Sea? That was unclear, because according to international rules, it was forbidden. And this is where a story begins that feels more like a detective novel than a naval chronicle. Imagine you've built a giant truck, but to leave the factory, you have to go through customs. And at customs, there's a rule. No trucks allowed, only passenger cars. What do? You take your documents. And in the type of vehicle field, you write passenger car, a very large passenger car. That is exactly what the Soviet Union did with the Kiev aircraft carrier. Let me explain in order. In 1936, in the Swiss city of Montreux, several states signed an international agreement. It regulated the passage of warships through two narrow straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. This is the only sea route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Whoever controls the straits controls the entire Black Sea fleet. The agreement, known as the Montreux Convention, contained a clear rule. Aircraft carriers do not pass through these straits. The Soviet Union was building the Kiev at the Black Sea shipyard in the Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv. That is, the shore of the Black Sea. To move the finished ship to its place of service, the Northern Fleet in Murmansk, it had to go through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. There is no other way. Going around the Atlantic through the Arctic is thousands of extra miles and months of travel. So, they had to go through the straits. But aircraft carriers were banned, a dead end. And here, Soviet military lawyers found a loophole that is striking in its simplicity. The Kiev is not an aircraft carrier, officially, on paper. The ship received the classification Heavy Aircraft Carrying Cruiser. Note the wording, not an aircraft carrier, not just an aircraft carrier, but a cruiser, which carries aviation. A cruiser with aircraft. A fundamental difference. The convention bans aircraft carriers from passing through the straits. There's not a word about cruisers. Therefore, a cruiser with aircraft can pass through. It was a legal trick. Everyone understood it. Turkey, which controlled the straits, understood. Western governments understood. Military analysts understood. But formally, there was nothing to complain about. The documents were in order. The column said, cruiser. While the lawyers were refining the wording, work was buzzing on the banks of the southern Bug River in Mykolaiv. The laying of the Kiev took place in February 1970. Construction was carried out in secret. Access to the plant was strictly by permit. Photography was forbidden. Foreign delegations were not invited to Mykolaiv. But you can't hide from satellites. American intelligence tracked the construction from orbit. Analysts in Washington watched as something large grew on the stalks. Very large. Unlike any Soviet ship they had seen before. Inside the plant, work went on around the clock. Welders, installers, electricians, thousands of people on one ship. The smell of burning metal, the roar of riveting, the blue flashes of welding in the dark of the hangars. The whole grew section by section. On December 24, 1972, the Kiev was launched. This is not yet a finished ship. Launching is the moment when the hull first touches the water. There were still years of fitting out, equipment installation, and testing ahead. But it is an important date. The ship ceased to be a blueprint and a pile of metal. It became a ship. And on that very same day, December 24th, 1972, at the same plant, they laid the next ship in the series, the Minsk, a brother twin. While the Kiev was being launched, a new hull took its place on the slipway. The Soviet Union was building a fleet of aircraft carriers, plural. Now only one thing remained: to finish the Kiev, bring it into service, and show it to the world. To pass through the straits in front of all of Europe. To prove that the classification works, that the legal trick had worked. In December 1975, the ship officially joined the fleet, and the following summer, the voyage began, and the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization took their seats by the portholes. Summer 1976, Istanbul, the shores of the Bosphorus. The strait at its narrowest point is just over 700 meters wide. On the right, the European shore. On the left, the Asian one. People are standing on the embankments, watching the water. They had never seen anything like this before. From around the bend, a ship slowly emerges. Not just big, huge, gray like the winter sky. The superstructure rises several stories high. On the deck, aircraft. Real combat aircraft, frozen on the open deck in the middle of a city. The ship moves so slowly that it seems motionless. Only the water ripples away from the bow in tight waves. This is the Kiev. It is exiting the Black Sea. The Turkish authorities gave permission for passage. The legal trick with the documents had worked. Officially, they were facing a cruiser. A very large cruiser with aircraft on deck. There was nothing to complain about. But as soon as the Kiev entered the Aegean Sea, everything changed. First, the ships appeared. Military ones. Under the flags of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They didn't get too close. They didn't block the way. They just sailed alongside and took pictures. Then the reconnaissance planes appeared. They circled above the Kiev at different altitudes. They photographed the deck, the hull, the superstructures, the antennas, every detail. Somewhere underwater, submarines were moving. They weren't visible, but the Soviet sonar operators on the Kiev could hear them. Western military analysts had been waiting for this moment for years. They knew the ship was being built. They knew roughly what it carried. But they had only seen images from satellites, blurry, taken from orbit. Now, the object was right in front of them, in the open sea, in daylight. One Western naval officer later wrote in his report something to the effect of, "In a few days of tracking, we gained more information about this ship than in the previous 5 years of observation." The Soviet sailors on the Kiev saw all of this, and they didn't object, because that is exactly what they were aiming for. Think about it. The Soviet Union took the ship into international waters, where everyone who wanted to could legally photograph it. This was not a failure of secrecy. It was its conclusion. The secret was no longer needed. The ship exists. It is sailing. It is real. Let them look. Then the Kiev entered the Mediterranean, and there, what everything was essentially planned for happened. A plane took off from the deck. The Yakovlev Yak-36M carrier-based attack plane. The first Soviet combat aircraft with vertical takeoff and landing. It could rise into the air without a runway, straight from a standstill. The engines pointed down. The thrust pushed the air against the deck. The machine slowly lifted off the ship and went into the sky. It was the first time a Soviet carrier-based plane had taken off outside the Soviet Union. Western pilots and reconnaissance planes over the Kiev saw this. They photographed it. They transmitted the data to their bases, and the next day, a second one took off. But here is the interesting part. All those days of tracking, thousands of photos, mountains of intelligence reports, they recorded what was outside, the deck, the planes, the antennas, the superstructures. But what was inside the Kiev, what made it truly dangerous, could not be seen from the outside. You couldn't photograph it from a passing plane. And that is exactly what we need to talk about next. Let's talk about what the Kiev really was. Because most people, looking at photos of this ship, see one thing. A big ship with planes on the deck. And they think, well, a Soviet aircraft carrier, like the American ones, just with a red star. That is a fundamentally wrong understanding. An American aircraft carrier is a floating airfield. Its main weapon is the planes. Dozens of combat aircraft that can fly hundreds of kilometers and strike any target. The ship itself, meanwhile, is almost defenseless. It depends on the planes and the escort ships around it. The Kiev was built on a completely different logic. The Soviet admirals weren't trying to copy the American idea. They decided to destroy that idea. Literally. The Kiev's main task was simple: find an American carrier group and sink the carrier before its planes could take off. For this, they installed a missile strike complex on the ship called Bazalt. 8 launch containers built right into the bow of the deck. Each container held a missile 11.5 meters long and weighing about 4.5 tons. 4.5 tons is roughly 3 ordinary passenger cars, flying at you at 2.5 times the speed of sound. The range was up to 550 kilometers. This meant the following. The Kiev could be so far from an American carrier that it wouldn't even be visible through binoculars from the carrier's deck, yet still have the carrier in its sights. A sniper against a boxer. A boxer is dangerous, but only if you let him get close enough. But the missiles were only part of the picture. The Kiev carried powerful anti-submarine weaponry, rocket depth charge launchers, torpedoes, Kamov Ka-25 anti-submarine helicopters. This helicopter was created specifically for hunting submarines. It could hover over the water, lower a hydroacoustic sensor on a cable, and listen to the depths. Plus, anti-aircraft missile complexes for protection against air attacks. Plus, artillery installations. Plus, an air group. Up to 12 Yakovlev Yak-38 carrier-based attack planes, and more than 20 helicopters. This wasn't an aircraft carrier. It was a universal combat complex that could attack targets in the air, on the water, and underwater simultaneously. Western analysts, after studying all the intelligence data, came to an uncomfortable conclusion. They had no simple answer to such a ship. Now, one important point that is worth realizing. All these weapons, 8 Bazalt missiles, torpedoes, depth charge launchers, anti-aircraft complexes. During the entire time the Kiev was in service, none of these systems were ever used in a real battle. Not once. Not against a single target. The ship was created for a war that never began. In 1985, when the Kiev was returning from a deployment to the shores of Algeria, the crew was announced an award, the Order of the Red Banner, for high performance in combat training. The sailors celebrated, they drank, they sang, they thought about home. None of them knew that the Soviet Empire had less than 10 years left, and that this order was the last thing the Kiev would receive for its service. Let's return to the board of the Kiev. 1985. The crew is celebrating the order. They are laughing, singing, hugging. Outside the portholes, the Mediterranean Sea. Now let's fast forward 7 years. 1992. The same ship, the same corridors, the same armor-plated steel. Silence. The Soviet Union is gone. On December 25, 1991, President Mikhail Gorbachev signed his resignation. That same evening, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin and the Russian tricolor was raised. The country that built the Kiev ceased to exist. What happens to a military fleet when a state suddenly disappears? The ships don't go anywhere. They stay at their moorings. But the money for their maintenance disappears along with the country. The fuel runs out. There are no spare parts. Repairs aren't done. Pay is delayed for months. And people start leaving. Not deserting, just leaving. Quietly. One after another. An officer who has nothing to feed his family writes a resignation letter. A warrant officer finds a job on a civilian ship. A young sailor, after his mandatory service, doesn't even return home. On the Kiev, the design crew consisted of 1,600 people. By 1992, less than 100 remained on board. Imagine this, a ship nearly 3 football fields long, hundreds of cabins, corridors, battle stations, engine rooms, and less than 100 people in all that space. Footsteps in empty passageways. Lights are on only where someone is. The rest is darkness. People left quickly, sometimes very quickly. Personal belongings remained in the cabins. Photos taped to the bulkheads. Books on the shelves. Someone's naval uniform hung on a hook by the door. A chessboard with pieces set up. A game in the middle, which no one ever finished. Not because people forgot to take their things. It's just that at some point, those things stopped seeming important. It was more important to find a job. It was more important to feed the children. The fleet didn't die in battle. The fleet died from silence and a lack of money. In 1991, the Kiev went on a mission for the last time. After that, only a parking spot. First in one port, then in another. In 1993, the ship was officially decommissioned from the Russian Navy. The reason in the documents was formulated briefly: lack of funding. By then, the Kiev had already significantly exhausted its technical lifespan. Restoration would have required huge amounts of money. There was no money. Decommissioning was inevitable. While the Kiev rusted at the pier, its brother ships were undergoing their own tragedies. The Novorossiysk, the third ship in the series, was sold to South Korea. There, it was cut for metal. Nothing remained of the ship. The Minsk, the very same twin brother, laid down on the day of the Kiev's launch in December 1972, was sold to China, also supposedly for scrap. But about that, a little later. The Kiev stood at the dock of the Vidyayevo naval base on the Kola Peninsula. It rusted. It waited. Admiral Gorshkov, who once secured the funding for this ship and this entire fleet, died in 1988, 3 years before the collapse of the country he served. He didn't have to see what happened next. Maybe it was for the best, because what followed was a conversation about money, about how much Soviet military power is worth on the open market. And the figures that emerged in that conversation are offensive, even today, even if you never served on this ship and have no relation to it whatsoever. Vidyayevo Naval Base, Kola Peninsula, several hundred kilometers beyond the Arctic Circle. If you have never been to these places, imagine this. Gray sky almost all year round. Hills covered in sparse forest. A bay that in winter breathes thick steam over the dark water. A wind that never stops. This is where the Kiev stood. It rusted, year after year. Orange streaks appeared on the hull. The paint peeled off in sheets. No one painted it. There was no one and no money for it. The ship, which was built by thousands of people, which was maintained by a crew of 1,600, now simply took up space at the dock. Somewhere in the late 90s, movement began. The exact date and the exact circumstances of the Kiev's sale still cause debate. Different sources name different companies, different names, different schemes. That in itself says a lot. When a deal is transparent, everyone writes about it the same way. When versions diverge, it means someone really didn't want the details to be known. Here is what is known for sure. The ship was sold for $1.6 million. $1.6 million. Let's understand what that is in real numbers. An average apartment in the center of London at that time cost about the same, maybe a little more. An aircraft carrier, a ship on which the Soviet Union spent hundreds of millions of rubles. A ship that held the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization in tension for 15 years. A ship 273 meters long, weighing 30,000 tons, sold for roughly the price of a London apartment. According to some data, the primary buyer was an American-Chinese company called Maritime Suppliers. According to others, some unnamed individuals whose names did not appear in the documents. Officially, one thing was announced. The ship is going for scrap. Cut it up and smelt it. But here's what happened next. The same ship, or the rights to it, was resold. This time, the buyer was the Chinese side. The transaction price was $8.2 million. $8.2 million against $1.6 million. The difference is $6.6 million in a few months on the same ship. Who got this money? We don't know. The names of the intermediaries never officially appeared anywhere. The scheme was set up so that it's hard to find the end, maybe impossible. And this is part of the story. Not a technical detail, but a symptom of that time when huge assets of the Soviet era passed from hand to hand at prices that had nothing to do with their real value. The Minsk had less luck, or more, depending on how you look at it. It was also sold to China, but there it was actually cut for scrap. Nothing remained of the ship, laid down on the same day as the Kiev. The Novorossiysk was sold to South Korea, also cut for scrap. The Kiev, the only one of the three, survived. Why will become clear in a few minutes. In the summer of 2000, a tugboat approached the Vidyevo base. The mooring lines were cast off. The ship slowly moved away from the dock, where it had spent the last few years. It never returned. The tugboat pulled the Kiev to the east, across the North Sea, past Scandinavia, through the Baltic, further to the south around Europe, through the Indian Ocean, then to the north along the Asian coast. The journey took several months. At the end of this path was the Chinese port city of Tianjin. And there, something completely unexpected awaited the Kiev. Tianjin, northern China, Bohai Bay. If you look at the map, it's about 120 kilometers southeast of Beijing, one of the country's largest port cities. Industrial, business, noisy. Cranes above the horizon. The smell of salt and machine oil. Constant movement of ships in the bay. That is where they brought the Kiev in 2000. When the huge gray hull slowly entered the port, local dockers stopped and watched. It's not every day they bring a military ship of that size into your port, especially a Soviet aircraft carrier. Especially alive, not cut up, with superstructures and antennas still in place. Officially, it was announced, the ship is destined for recycling, into metal. But the scrap cutters never appeared. Instead, negotiations began. Inspection of the ship, examination of the premises, measurements, and gradually, work of a completely different kind. Tianjin was building a new district. The district was called Bohai, a large urban project, housing, trade, entertainment, parks. And within the framework of this project, an idea arose. A theme park dedicated to the history of aviation. The Kiev fit this idea perfectly. A huge ship, real, with a deck from which attack planes took off, with a history that can be told to tourists. This is not a mock-up or a pavilion. This is a real object that survived the Cold War and arrived in Tianjin under its own power, or rather, by tugboat, but those are details. By 2003, the Kiev became part of the Bohai theme park, and in 2004, they opened the doors to everyone. The price of an entry ticket, 110 yuan. At the exchange rate at the time, about $13 to $14. For that money, you got access to 5 decks of the ship. Let's walk through it together. The upper deck, the very one from which the Yakovlev Yak-38 carrier-based attack planes rose into the air. Now there are mock-ups of planes and helicopters here. Not real ones, models. But placed as if real ones would stand. By the side, nose to the wind, wings folded. If you don't look too closely, it's almost believable. Below, the second and third decks. Here begins the part that, in their own words, took visitors' breath away. The cabins are preserved. Battle stations are preserved. Not as props, as they were. Narrow corridors with pipes along the ceiling. Heavy watertight doors with circular locking mechanisms. Metal ladders between decks, steep, like stairs in a cellar. People who served on similar ships, Soviet, Russian, any, and later ended up aboard the Kiev in Tianjin, wrote the same thing. The smell. Ships have a special smell. Metal, oil, stale air in enclosed spaces. That smell didn't go anywhere. And the things. Personal belongings in the cabins. Remember, I spoke about this in the beginning? About how people left quickly and left everything as is. Photos, books, a chessboard with an unfinished game. All of this ended up here, in Tianjin. Thousands of kilometers from Vidyevo and from Murmansk. A guide told tourists about the ship's history, about its voyages, about the planes. Chinese tourists photographed the cabins of Soviet officers. Sometimes, touch things with their hands. Carefully. Metal doesn't forget. On weekends, entertainment shows were held on board. Dance programs on the open deck. music over the bay, viewers on plastic chairs where the missile containers of the Bazalt complex used to stand. It's hard to call it right or wrong. It's just a different life. A second life for a ship that was supposed to have a completely different verdict. This continued for several years. And then the investors arrived. They looked at the ship. They looked at the tourists. They looked at the decks and corridors. And they saw something that the guide didn't mention in their stories. They saw 148 hotel rooms. 2011. The investors made a decision. They invested $15 million into the ship. For comparison, the ship itself had been sold a few years earlier for $1.6 million. Now they were investing 10 times more into its conversion. That in itself says that the people who made this decision understood. In front of them wasn't just an old ship sitting around. In front of them was an object with a history. And you can make money on that history. Work went on for about a year. They didn't touch the outside of the ship. The same gray holes, the same superstructures, the same deck with mock-up planes. The Kiev remained similar to itself. Inside, everything changed. Corridors were widened where possible. New electrical wiring was installed. Modern ventilation was installed, so guests wouldn't feel that same smell of metal and oil I told you about earlier. Although, honestly, some guests wrote later that the smell remained anyway. Metal isn't that easy to silence. In place of cabins and service rooms, 148 hotel rooms appeared. Let me list what that is exactly. 2 presidential classrooms, 3 VIP classrooms. The remaining 143 are standard rooms of various categories. The total area of the hotel is 6,000 square meters. A restaurant, a bar, and a recreation club operate on board. All this inside a military ship. Inside the same armor-plated steel that the scouts of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization saw in '76. Now, one moment that I ask you to truly feel. Let's take a specific room. It's called Yalta. This is a former officer's compartment. Here, on these few square meters, a Soviet officer spent nights between watches. Here, he possibly laid out operational maps of the Atlantic or Mediterranean Sea. Marked routes. Thought about what the American fleet was doing right now and how to counter it. Today, there is a bed with white linen in this compartment, a nightstand, a TV, a minibar. On the door, a sign, Yalta. A Soviet officer chose this name for the city in Crimea, where in '45 the winners divided the world. Now this name is on the door of a hotel room in Chinese Tianjin, for $200 a night, breakfast included. And that is not even the strangest part. There is a Moscow room, the name of the capital of the state that built this ship, a state that no longer exists. Written in Russian on a sign, in a Chinese hotel, aboard a Soviet aircraft carrier. Who comes here? According to reviews on the internet, a very diverse crowd. Chinese tourists interested in military history. Foreigners who travel to Tianjin specifically to spend the night on a real combat ship. Sometimes, former military sailors from different countries. They walk through the corridors, touch the bulkheads with their hands, and are silent. Guides don't usually approach such guests. They understand. There is something personal here. Imagine that you served on this ship, spent years of your life here, went out into the Atlantic, into the Mediterranean, know every corridor, every ladder, every compartment, and you come to Tianjin. You pay $200, you take the key to your room, and you walk through the corridors of your ship to your bed with white linen. What you feel at that moment, I don't know. But I know one thing. This ship survived the Cold War, survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, survived years of rust in Vidyevo, survived a chain of dark resales, and it is still standing. Welcomes people, gives them a roof over their heads, even if that roof is armor-plated steel, and outside the walls are the waters of Bohai Bay. Metal doesn't forget. Only the Kiev in this sense was lucky, because its brother ships, ships laid down at the same plant, by the same hands, from the same blueprints, ended their stories quite differently. 4 ships, One project, one plant, one set of blueprints, laid down in one decade on the same slipways by the same workers. Identical hulls, identical lines, identical armor-plated steel. By design, brothers. By fate, completely different people. Let's go through each one. Novorossiysk, the third ship in the series, commissioned in 1982, served in the Pacific Fleet. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Novorossiysk story turned out to be the shortest of the four. It was sold to South Korea, not to a museum, not to a park, not to a hotel, for metal. The ship was cut up. Nothing remained of it. No plaque, no place where you can come and say, here it is. Just vanished. Smelted into beams and sheets that went into some construction site. The third ship in the series ceased to exist entirely, as if it never was. Now, the Minsk, the Kiev's twin brother, the very one they laid down on the day of the Kiev's launch, December 24th, 1972. It was also sold to China, and at first it seemed that the Minsk had the same luck as the Kiev. The ship wasn't cut up immediately. It was turned into a theme park in the southern Chinese city of Shenzhen. Tourists walked on the decks, took photos, bought souvenirs. But that story ended differently. The park was closed. The ship stood for several years without work. And then they finally came with cutters. The Minsk was taken apart for metal. December 24th, 1972. One day, one launch, one new keel on the slipway. Two ships from one plant, from one set of hands. One stands in Tianjin and rents rooms to guests. The other is nowhere. That's fate for you. Now, the fourth ship, Baku. Commissioned in 1987. In 1990, it was renamed, in honor of the very same admiral who once secured the funding for this entire fleet. The ship received the name Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, Gorshkov. Gorshkov died in '88. The ship with his name served for a few more years, and also ended up at the dock after '91. But here the story took an unexpected turn. In 2004, Russia concluded an agreement with India. The ship was sold to the Indian side. Not for metal, not to a park, but for real military service. The ship went to Severodvinsk, to a ship repair plant. There, they took it apart and put it back together almost from scratch for 10 years. They changed everything. Engines, electronics, weapons, aviation equipment. Only the steel hull foundation remained of the Soviet original. Everything else is new. In 2013, the ship was handed over to India. There, it was renamed. Today, it is called Vikramaditya. This word in Sanskrit means son of power, or valiant as the sun. Under this name, it serves in the Indian Ocean. On board are Indian pilots. Above it is the Indian flag. The fourth ship of the Mykolaiv plant is still in service, the only one of the series, but no longer Soviet, no longer Russian. 4 ships. Look at what happened. One cut up in South Korea, disappeared completely. One cut up in China, disappeared completely. One stands as a hotel in Tianjin, living a second life, but no longer as a ship. One serves in the Indian Ocean, living a third life, but under a different name and a different flag. Of the 4 ships, not one finished as it was intended. Not one stands at a Russian pier. Not one serves under the flag under which it was launched. Empires build ships. Ships outlive empires. But what happens to them afterwards, that is no longer the history of the Navy. This is a story about people, about those who lived on these ships, who painted their hulls, stood watches in their corridors, looked out their portholes at foreign shores. That is the people we need to talk about. What did it mean to serve on the Kiev? Not in the sense of military duty and the oath, That is understood. I mean something else. What did it mean every day? In a domestic, human sense. People who served on large ships talk about it similarly, regardless of the fleet and the country. A ship is a separate world. Closed, complete, self-sufficient. Outside, the ocean. Inside, everything you need for life. Food, sleep, work, people. The same faces every day. The same corridors. The same sounds. The hum of the engines under your feet. The creak of bulkheads in the waves. Announcements over the ship's PA system. After a few months, you know this ship as well as you know your own apartment. Better. Because you don't spend 24 hours a day, months at a time, in your own apartment. Veterans who served on Soviet naval ships in the 70s and 80s remember one common feeling: pride. Not official, not ceremonial, living. Because the Kiev was not just a ship. It was the first. The only one of its kind. When you went out onto the deck and saw the escort ships following you, saw your own helicopters circling above you, you understood. You are part of something that didn't exist before. One of the veterans wrote in his memoirs something to the effect of, when the Kiev was passing through the English Channel, the strait between France and England, and people were watching it from the shore through binoculars, he wasn't thinking about military confrontation. He thought, they are standing there and watching and seeing us. Then the 90s came. Veterans talk about this time briefly, sparingly. Some don't talk at all. The ship is sitting there. There is no money. What happens next, no one says. There are no official announcements, just silence from above. And the feeling that everything you devoted years to is slowly rusting at the dock along with the ship. Many learned about the sale of the Kiev not from official sources, from the newspapers, by accident. Opened the newspaper in the morning, and there it was. A short notice. Ship sold. Buyer, Chinese side. Supposedly for scrap. One veteran wrote about this moment. I read the note 3 times. Thought I had confused something. I hadn't. Some of those who served on the Kiev eventually made it to Tianjin. Some traveled specifically. Some happened to be in China for other business and decided to drop by. They described this experience differently. One person wrote that he walked through the corridors and couldn't stop. Just walked and walked. Recognized every turn, every ladder, every door. Then stopped at one compartment. Stood there for a long time. Inside was someone else's bed with white linen. On the nightstand, someone else's glass with toothbrushes. He stood there and walked on. Another wrote briefly, "It's good they didn't cut it. Let it stand." A third wrote nothing, only posted a photo on the internet. He is standing on the very deck where he once stood watch. Behind him is Bohai Bay. You can't make out the face in the shot, but by the way he stands, arms along his body, shoulders straight, gaze into the water, everything is clear without words. A ship is not metal. One of the veterans said a phrase that I haven't been able to get out of my head since I read it. He said, "A ship is the people who lived on it. Metal is just what is left after them. People scattered into their own lives. Someone died. Someone is living out their days on a pension somewhere. Someone sometimes takes out old photos, black and white with bent corners, and looks at a young face in uniform. Remembers the smell of machine oil and the hum of the engines under their feet. And the metal remained. Stands in Tianjin, accepts guests, looks at Bohai Bay. And now, the final question. Not technical, not historical, personal. What does all this mean? Let's return to where we started. China, Tianjin, Bohai Bay. A man is ordering breakfast to the room. The room is called Moscow. Outside the walls is armor-plated steel. Outside the board is water. From the outside, the ship looks almost the same as it looked in '76, when frigates of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization sailed after it and reconnaissance planes circled it. Only now, no one is tracking it. No one needs to. I thought about this story for a long time, and here is what I came to. We are used to measuring strength in understandable units. Number of ships, missile range, tonnage, speed, engine power. These figures are easy to compare, easy to understand, easy to fear. The Kiev was strong by all these metrics. 8 missiles capable of sinking an aircraft carrier from a distance of 550 kilometers, 30,000 tons of displacement, 273 meters of length, a crew of 1,600 people. But not one of these missiles was ever fired in a real battle. Not one. A ship created to inspire fear, for its entire life never made a single shot at a real target. It existed as a threat, as a possibility, as an argument in a conversation that both sides conducted through sights, but never brought to a shot. Maybe that is the main meaning of this whole story. The most powerful weapon of the Cold War worked precisely because it was never used. The fear of it was real. The war itself was not. Now look at what became of this weapon. The Soviet Union spent huge amounts of money and years of labor to build a ship that would hold half the world in tension. This ship served for less than 20 years. Then the country that built it vanished. The ship was sold for the price of a London apartment, resold for more, brought to a Chinese port city, turned into a park, then a hotel, and now tourists sleep in its cabins. That is what happens to strength when the era that birthed that strength ends. It doesn't disappear immediately. It just changes meaning, ceases to be a threat, becomes an exhibit, then an attraction, then a hotel. Each subsequent owner sees something of their own in it. Someone sees scrap metal. Someone sees history. Someone sees 148 rooms at $200 a night. None of them sees what the sailors who lived on this ship saw. And here I want to stop for a second and tell you something directly. This story is not about the Soviet Union, not about the Cold War, not about aircraft carriers. All these things are just scenery. The story is about something else. About the fact that any strength is temporary. Any empire eventually ends. And what it built with such seriousness, with such tension of all its resources, later becomes a tourist object, or scrap, or a hotel with a Moscow room in Tianjin. This is not a tragedy. This is just how time is arranged. The only thing that doesn't follow this logic is people, their memory, what they felt standing on the deck in the open ocean, what they thought looking out the porthole at foreign shores, how they later stood in the corridors of their former ship, already as tourists, already with a ticket for 110 yuan in their pocket, and were silent. This is not written down in any documents. This is not photographed from any satellites. This cannot be sold, smelted, or converted into a hotel room. It just was. Now in Tianjin, it is night. The ship is standing in the dark. Quiet. The hotel lights are out. 148 guests are sleeping behind armored bulkheads. On the upper deck are mock-ups of planes. They won't fly anywhere. They just stand, nose to the wind, over Bohai Bay. Somewhere in the depths of the hull are steel bulkheads that remember the Atlantic. Remember the Mediterranean Sea. Remember the cold Murmansk wind and the hum of engines at full speed. Remember the voices of 1,600 people who lived here. Metal doesn't forget. Only people sometimes forget that behind every big ship, behind every big idea, behind every big empire, stand simply people who woke up in the morning, drank tea, thought about home, did their work, and one day left, leaving a chessboard with an unfinished game.